So in chapter 3, this is kind of like the heart of the discussion. And by that I mean when you tell someone that you're taking economics and they don't remember very much from when they took the course, probably the only thing that they will say is supply and demand, or demand and supply, and they'll just kind of leave it at that. I would argue this is not the most important thing you will learn in this class. It's useful. I mean, it's a useful set of tools for understanding why prices are what they are. At the same time, you'll likely use this to kind of understand, or at least follow along with what other people are saying. On the other hand, it has limited use, and you are going to see this again when you take microeconomics. So for some of you, this will be a repeat of what you've already seen. Okay, so what is it basically, right? So that's kind of our first kind of thing to deal with here. So for as a review of what we've done so far, in chapter 1, we looked at this issue of scarcity existing, meaning that I only have so many resources in which to meet most likely unlimited wants and needs. And that we took from that this idea that we could try to graph out what this scarcity looks like, and that the measurement of that scarcity, that requires a trade-off. The measurement of that trade-off can be measured along the production possibilities frontier, where that measurement is termed the opportunity cost. So essentially, in chapter 1, we talked about scarcity existing. And in chapter 2, we talked about how different countries deal with this scarcity of resources in order to produce goods and services. And that one way they act to get around or to react to this scarcity is by engaging in trade. What chapter 3 does with supply and demand is it looks at the primary way that we organize most of our society, and that most of our society is organized with markets. And that what markets do for us is they generate two key pieces of information. And so again, I'm kind of giving you a preview here of what you're going to see, only because I don't like these lectures to be like murder mysteries, where you don't find out until the end what's going on. The idea of what we're going to do is, what is a market? A market would be for a particular good. So let's say that we're talking about soda. Okay, so we're going to talk about the soda market. That what we're going to do is create an XY space, meaning this is the x-axis and this is the y-axis. And what we're going to do is have two variables. These two variables, we're going to understand that one variable changing causes the other variable to change, right? And this is kind of going back to chapter 2 when we talked about models. This supply and demand is a model. And that the way that we graph this out then is that on the x-axis, we typically talk about the quantity of the good, so the quantity of soda, and on the y-axis, we put the price of soda. And that what we're basically going to say is that there's a relationship between the price and the quantity, and that we need to deal with this from two perspectives. From the perspective of those who are buying things and those who are producing and selling the things. When we're talking about the consumer, that would be like me and you, what we're going to see is that the demand is downward sloping. So it's basically, this is plotting out a relationship between the price of the good and the quantity of the good. That as the price goes down, the quantity demanded, or the quantity we would want to buy, goes up. And that by contrast, from the supply perspective, that it is upward sloping. And that what it looks like is that as the price goes up, producers want to produce more. Now, obviously, your eyes should be somewhat attracted to this point, because that's going to give us our two pieces of information here. It's going to give us our information about the price, and it's going to give us our data about the quantity. I mean, it shouldn't be too weird to understand this now, that if I were buying like a bottle of Coke, it typically is about $2, right, at a typical grocery store. Yes, there's little differences here and there, and you know, if you buy it at a more expensive grocery store or whatnot. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know about you. Maybe the prices are higher for me, but I don't know. When I buy a 20-ounce bottle of Coke, it's about like $2.29 or something like that. And the prices don't change too much between different sellers. And so there we go, right? We're seeing this kind of similarity in the price and the quantity. And the idea is that if I charge a price very different from this price, what we're going to call the equilibrium price, well, then I end up in a situation where there's going to be a difference between the supply curve and the demand curve at that point. And that's going to cause problems that the market's going to resolve. That's where we're going to go with this chapter. So, what are we going to do in this chapter? We're going to look at four things. We're going to look at the fundamentals of a market, basically how do we construct what a market is. Then we're going to look at what is the variables and whatnot that go behind the demand curve. Then we're going to look at the variables that are behind the supply curve. And then finally, we're going to finish it up by looking at how those two curves come together and generate for us equilibriums. Okay. So when we take this a little further here, what we're looking at when we look at a market, that a market represents just a single good or service, and that each of these functions, one for demand and one for supply, have multiple determinants. So the way that I would like you to kind of think of it, or at least the way that it seems a bit more intuitive for me, is that we would essentially say that quantity demanded, or Q subscript D, when I say Q subscript D, what I'm saying here is quantity demanded, that quantity demanded is a function of variables 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so I'm just going to write it out like this just for convenience sake, just because I don't want to write all these out. And that on this side, we would say that quantity supplied, so Q subscript S standing for quantity supplied, is a function of variables 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have multiple variables here, all determining something, right? Multiple variables determining something, giving us our quantity demanded. And that in addition to all of these variables, that it's also the price, right? Determinants, price, as well as variables 1 through 5. Determinants, price, as well as variables 1 through 6. So what does that mean? So, right, I told you I buy Coke. That's my drink of choice. Yeah, not really, actually. I really like lemonade, but I don't know, a really good tart lemonade, I don't know, seems a lot more enjoyable than Coke. But right, So I started my day off today. I stayed up late last night, and then I had to get up early to take the kids to school, and I don't know, I just needed caffeine. Now, what's important to me? Well, in this case, my income matters. The alternatives of what I could have bought instead that would have been kind of close to Coke, right? Maybe like coffee or Red Bull or something like that. My own taste and preferences, how many people want to buy it, what I'm expecting the price to be in the future. We're going to talk about all these variables, taxes and subsidies. But, dude, I also care about the price, right? And if it's $1, well, then maybe I'll buy more than one. And if it's $10, maybe I'll buy none. And for the seller, right, if it's $1, they're going to behave in a different way in terms of how much they produce versus if they can get $10 a bottle. What would we generally expect? Well, generally we would expect that the cheaper the price of the good, the more you and I would all buy. Everything else being held constant. Remember that assumption from before? What did we call that? We called that ceteris paribus. We said, right, that if everything else is held constant, basically meaning in this quantity demanded case, variables 1 through 6, if I hold variables 1 through 6 constant, then the question would be is what is the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded? That in general, that what we would see, sorry, I'm trying to find where my pen is here, that price and quantity demanded are inversely related. When one goes up, the other goes down. This simplification here is ceteris paribus. That means that variables 1 through 6 are constant. And this is known as the law of demand. So what the law of demand is saying is that essentially that if I hold variables 1 through 6 constant, meaning ceteris paribus, right, I can just shorten it as ceteris paribus, which again also just means the variables 1 through 6 are constant. Then as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. And as price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. We can say that as well here on the quantity supplied side. On the quantity supply side, we would say, right, producers being who they are, that price and quantity supplied are positively related, or directly related. That price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. And when price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. Ceteris paribus. What does that mean again? That would mean that variables 1 through 5 are being held constant. And so, we can take both this law of demand as well as this law of supply, and we can bring this all together to build a market. Now the idea is that if I get the price to be the same, such that the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, then we're going to see that we're in equilibrium. Otherwise, what is generated is a shortage or a surplus. Let's add a slide here and just kind of show you what's going on here. But essentially, what I can do here is I can put my quantity here on the y-axis, my price here on the x-axis. Here we're going to see is my downward sloping demand curve. Here would be my upward sloping supply curve. What we're going to see is that there is a particular price that if chosen, if the price that exists, that it generates the exact same quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So when quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, then we're in a situation where there's equilibrium. And we'll see this more about this term later. But what the end of that one slide was talking about is that, what if, for instance, the price is too high? Let's say it's at this price P2. At price P2, the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied, which is a shortage. And alternatively, the price, let's call it P3, that at P3, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Oh, sorry, I missed, sorry. I'm not going to fix this video just to make me look smarter here. Sorry, I was just looking at this too quickly. There's our surplus, and this is a shortage. Sorry. Quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded is a surplus. Think of it, producers are producing more than people are buying. That would mean your store shelves are overfilled. As opposed to here, producers aren't producing enough, which would basically be the definition of a shortage. Okay. So, if we look at a market, for instance, for gasoline, what would affect it? Well, right, we could look at things like people having alternatives to gasoline, right, which would be like having an electric car, or having, let's say, for instance, a hybrid car, which uses less gas, or if people start taking the bus, or if people get to work from home, etc., etc. All of these things and many other things would all affect the price of gasoline by affecting both the demand curve, but then we could also talk about how it affects the supply curve, right? Which would be how much oil do drillers have access to. Right, and so what we can see here is that as we put this all together, that the supply of goods or services, which is done by firms, that's our supply curve. The consumers are the ones that are doing the purchasing, that's our demand side. And that these two parties are interacting in this market in the way that, let's call it communication, between buyers and sellers is through the price. Right? This is how I basically communicate to the seller that what they're doing is either really, really right or really, really wrong. If the price is way too high, then consumers aren't going to buy it, and then the store shelves kind of really become overfilled with things. And if the price is too low, then there'll be a shortage for the item, thus causing changes in the price, right? So that one of the things that we see here is that when a shortage exists, it leads to the price going up. And we're going to see that when a surplus exists, it leads to the price falling. And again, just as a kind of a basic thing, I don't think this really needs a great deal of elaboration by me, but the idea would be is that a market isn't just a physical place where people meet. Instead, the market would just be anywhere where this price information is being communicated to others. Now, something that economists really like referring to is this idea of the invisible hand, with the idea that it's the invisible hand that's guiding resources to the most highly valued use. That essentially it's the invisible hand that's guiding the market to the equilibrium price. I mean, it's a nice, convenient story, but I'm not sure that that's entirely the case. You know, it's not, it's just not that simple. But that argument is basically used within markets when they're trying to ask for more limited government intervention, with the idea that I can, with limited government intervention, you can just let the market figure out how much will be produced and who will it be produced for, and allow the market to determine the price on its own. The only problem that we run into is that sometimes the market arrives at a price that we just think is unfair, right? So now notice what I said right there. That's a bit more of a normative statement. But the idea would be, for instance, we just had this debate this year, right? So one of the things that is a pretty big disease in the United States is diabetes. And yet the insulin that those who are diabetic, that insulin that they need, doesn't cost a lot to make it. It's not really, there's nothing special about it, right? I don't really know much about how you make insulin, right? But my understanding would be is that it's a kind of injectable sugar, right, where it helps your body process those sugars or regulate those body sugars. It's not complicated, though, to make it. And yet what we see is that people that suffer through diabetes find that they can't afford the $1,000 or so it might take to buy insulin. So I'm not pushing the Biden administration. One of the things you're going to learn throughout all these lectures is it's not that I have no opinions, it's just that, I don't know, I become more jaded as I've gotten older, and I'm not really sure it matters a great deal. Certainly for you, it doesn't matter at all what I think about the world. And I don't really, I mean, I care. I shouldn't say I don't care what you think about the world, but, you know, this isn't the class where we're going to talk about politics, and you shouldn't care what mine are, and I'm not going to assess you based on yours. But what the Biden administration did is it basically said that the market price for insulin is unfair, and that they were going to cap the price or limit the price to $30. That's something that we'll end up looking at here in Chapter 5 in this class, about why sometimes you set the price to be something other than what the invisible hand guided it to. But that generally has some consequences as well. Most of the markets that we're going to be talking about here are competitive markets, meaning that we have many buyers or sellers, and that no one has any undue influence over the price. So gas stations are a perfect example of a competitive market in the sense that, yes, you do find particular people that say I only buy X brand of gasoline or, you know, those other kinds of restrictions. But for the most part, you've got many buyers and sellers of gasoline. And for the most part, most of them compete almost solely on the basis of price. And no one gets to really set the price uniquely. Most sellers of gasoline charge rather similar prices. Most. Now, one of the things that, if you already took microeconomics course, one of the other things you would have learned about is that we do at times have imperfect markets, meaning that we have markets that are less competitive, with the extreme being monopoly. So then you'd say, well, why is there a picture of some diamonds down there? Well, the idea is that diamonds are so expensive because the company De Beers actually has a monopoly on most of the diamond mines. And so they can make the price essentially whatever they want it to be. These are extreme examples about how you price those kinds of things. But we don't have to deal with that here in this course. So for the most part in this chapter 3, we're going to just be talking about the existence of perfectly competitive markets that we're dealing with. Okay, so I've already said much about this already, but if we just kind of stick with this simple discussion here of what's being shown here. So again, I'm going to create an XY space, and I'm going to put quantity on the x-axis. We'll just make this the books market. That the price is here, and that my demand is going to have a downward slope. Why does it have a downward slope? Because of this law of demand, that all else equal, or said another way, ceteris paribus, or said another way, that variables 1 through 6 are constant, holding variables 1 through 6 constant, that variable 1 through 6 back from, what is it, slide 3 or whatever, holding variables 1 through 6 constant, ceteris paribus, that there is an inverse or negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, that when the price is high, the quantity is low, that when the price is low, the quantity is high. Why is there a law of demand? Well, we could understand this mathematically, but just keep it in mind this way. What is your willingness to pay for things when you don't have a lot of it? Most of us would say, oh God, I really want more and more of this. I'm willing to pay a really high price to get this thing that I don't have a lot of. Or you can look at it from the opposite perspective. When the price is really high, I say to myself, geez, I'm not going to buy a lot. You'd have to lower the price for me to buy more. But if you do lower the price, I definitely will buy more. And that's how we could understand that. On the other hand, when I've got a whole bunch of something, I'm really not willing to pay a lot for each individual item because I have a lot of it, right? It's not scarce. And so we can understand this demand in two ways. Again, I've already graphed out the curve, that it's downward sloping between price and quantity demanded. The alternative is that we could create a demand schedule, meaning I could list the numbers that would show this inverse relationship. And so here we can see the demand schedule. Healing crystals. And if I just plotted out all the different points, right, and so we could kind of understand this as, you could imagine that I had a chart like this, quantity demanded, Q subscript D, and my price here. Right, that I could see that at quantity 8, my price is 0, and that at the at quantity 8 the price is 0, or that at quantity 0 the price is $20, and then at 1 the price is $17.50, and at 2, it's $15, and so on and so forth, right, all the way down the line. Or, I guess it's pretty apparent here, I'm not really looking at the slides ahead of time here, or you could make it look beautiful and make it look like this. This would be both a downward sloping, and you can see all the plots pointed out. Now, what's cool about this, though, is that the law of demand is explaining the downward slope of the curve. It explains movements along the curve, from either left to right or from right to left. But as I change the price, so when I say change, I mean delta. As I change the price, the quantity demanded will change. Again, the triangle means delta, which just means change. And it explains how I move along the curve. Okay, I can't really get it right. It explains movements along the curve. Now, what we can do as well is we can add up all these points. So you can think of the demand by each of us being for the individual, and that we can add those up across individuals to get something that's a bit more comprehensive. So we can imagine that we add up individuals to get a market demand, and so here you could have The Rock and Emma. Right, and so we could say, okay, this is what The Rock, this is his determination of how many healing crystals he wants at the various prices. And here's Emma, who looks to be a bit more skeptical of the powers of healing crystals for those various prices. And basically, I can just add up to 2 individuals to get a market. So it'd be 3 plus 1 equals 4, and so on and so forth. Now, I don't think that this slide really highlights well enough the importance of this slide. So if you're starting to find that you're starting to lose it here, and you've been listening to Scheiding here for 33 minutes and 24 seconds, and you're like, geez, Scheiding, I'm getting really bored with what you're doing here. I can read the slides as well as you. This slide doesn't do a good enough job of highlighting this most confused thing. This is by far the thing that students, you who's listening to this lecture, this is the thing that most students don't understand, and where things get a little bit lost. So let's graph these out. What does this mean? A change in quantity demanded. So I'm going to put my quantity here on the x-axis. I'm going to put my price on the y-axis. Here's my demand curve. What I'm doing here is I'm explaining a movement, for instance, from A to B. A movement along the curve is only caused by a change in the price of the good itself. This is, again, my law of demand. That to move from A to B is it's saying if price falls, quantity demanded rises. And again, what that's requiring is that variables 1 through 6 are not changing at all, ceteris paribus, which is different than how the picture looks here. Because what this looks like is the demand curve actually shifting out. So I'm going to call this D prime, or in other words, going from A to B. So visually, you can already see that these look different. But the law of demand has nothing to do with the change in demand. I'll repeat that again. The law of demand has nothing to do with the change in demand. In other words, you shift the demand curve when something other than the price changes. Meaning a change in variables 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. One of these other variables are changing, meaning I am not using ceteris paribus anymore. So right, there's our movement along the curve. This is the law of demand in action. This is as price falls from $3 to $2, people buy more of it. Or, this is still law of demand, now this is just moving in the other direction here. And now what we're saying that as price goes up from 15 to 20, the quantity demanded falls, or in other words, people buy less. Right? Both of these are movements as opposed here to the shift. And we can shift in one of two directions. We can shift to the left or we can shift to the right. Meaning that here, going back to this, here we have an increase in quantity demanded. Here we have a decrease in quantity demanded. And then here, we can understand that when it shifts to the right, it's an increase, and this is important what I'm about to say here, it's an increase in demand. Not an increase in the quantity demanded, but an increase in demand. And I'll explain why that's important here. And when it shifts to the left, it's a decrease in demand. So there's a difference between demand and quantity demanded. Quantity demanded is the individual points along the curve. Demand is the entire curve itself. So right, if we go back to these slides here, what you can see is that I'm moving along the curve. I'm changing from point A to point B. I'm changing the quantity demanded. This is probably the most confused or the biggest mistake I see students do. This is a change in the quantity demanded. This is a change in demand. And again, you can see how it looks different. And this is caused, again, by changing variables 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And not the price. And so what we want to do now is look at each of these. Okay, so here we've got variable number 1. And variable number 1 would be changes in income. So, right, we can understand income going up and income going down. Now, how that changes, that's going to determine that's going to be determined by whether the good we're talking about is a normal good or an inferior good. A normal good, most goods, probably about 70% or so of goods, are normal goods, meaning that as my income goes up, I want more of it, and as my income goes down, I want less of it. I don't know, have you ever heard a person say, I've got too many cars, or I've got too much, basically too much of a good thing? No. What do rich people do? Rich people buy more houses, more cars, they have more marriages, right? I mean, this is what, are normal goods. On the other hand, we have kind of what's pictured on the bottom here, ramen. Ramen is something that you eat when you don't have a lot of income, right? You tend to eat it at a particular point in your life when you don't have a lot of income. And basically that as you get more income, you eat less and less of ramen, or that inferior good. Other examples of this would be like riding the city bus, carpooling, or even something like renting an apartment. These are all things that we do less of as our income goes up. Now, what that's going to mean here is that it's going to change then, if I have the same variable happening, it's going to change how the graph looks. So what we could have here is the same thing happening, for instance. Let's say that my income goes up. And if that event occurs, then you would need to know whether it's a normal good or an inferior good. And if it's a normal good, and my income is going up, so again, let's just call this cars because that's a pretty typical normal good. And here's my original demand curve. And that as a consequence of my income going up, my demand will shift to the right. So I'd have an increase in demand from D to D prime. Same event happening of income going up. And if it's an inferior good, meaning, let's say, for instance, like this ramen here, then here's my original demand curve. But now that increase in income, now I'm going to be like, dude, I'm not going to eat cheap ramen anymore. I'm going to eat fancy steak. And so here we would see the demand decreasing or shifting to the left. So this would be a decrease in demand. And here I would have an increase in demand. Okay. Variable 2 would be the price of related goods. And there's two relationships that can exist between goods. The goods can either be complements or they can be substitutes. Complements means that the goods are used together, or they're typically consumed together. Substitutes would be goods that replace each other. So especially from like a marketing perspective, you typically know the products you're selling pretty well, whether you have substitutes or complements that exist. For instance, I'd be pretty hard pressed to find a person that doesn't drink soda with pizza. The two pretty much do go hand in hand with each other. And so what we would say is that because they're complementary, then what we see is that the price of pizza can influence my my consumption of soda. And alternatively, when we're talking about substitutes where they replace each other, then the price of a pizza at Domino's will affect how much the demand is for pizza at Pizza Hut. Now, how would that look? You actually need to draw two different graphs for this. Let's just use the graph they created for us here, and then I'll expand on it a little bit more. So here we've got complementary goods. These would be peanut butter and jelly, right? They're used together with each other. And that what we're saying is that the price of peanut butter looks like it's gone up. So what do we know? We know from the law of demand that the quantity demanded is going to fall. So people are going to want less. People will buy less peanut butter because price is going up. That we just know from the law of demand, right? We didn't do anything ingenious there. That was just from the law of demand. But if people are buying less peanut butter, now I'll repeat this again, but because people are buying less peanut butter, then they also buy less jelly. Because I guess in this case we're saying, in this case, if they're buying less peanut butter, then they also just don't need that much jelly. Because jelly they only buy because they use it with peanut butter. And so in the peanut butter market, the picture looks like this. It's a movement along the curve, right? Caused by the law of demand. But in the jelly market, there's a shift. Because why are people buying less jelly? Not because the price of jelly changed, but rather because the price of a complementary good changed. I'm not sure why they didn't add another slide here. Well, let's add it here. If they are substitutes, so this would be like, let's say, Coke and Pepsi, which I'm not getting into debates about which one is better. But essentially what we'd be saying here is that here's my Coke market, and let's say that the price of Coke went up. Then what do we know? From the law of demand, we know that the quantity demanded of Coke will fall. So there'd be a movement along the demand curve for Coke. But now what we see is that people are buying, that the price of Coke is going up. What are people going to do? They're going to buy more Pepsi. And that here in the Pepsi market, it's going to shift. There's going to be an increase in demand. An increase in the demand for Pepsi, not caused by the fact that the price of Pepsi went up. Rather, it's an increase in the demand for Pepsi because the price of some alternative good went up. Some substitute good went up. And so people just decided to consume more Pepsi rather than the more expensive Coke. And then we get variable 3, taste and preferences. This one's pretty easy. Things, fashions change, preferences change, and this would be people buying more of something or less of something because taste and preferences change. This isn't, right? So we would just draw a very simple graph. For instance, COVID caused people to buy more masks. So it will just look like that, shifting out the demand curve. And then we've got variables 4, 5, and 6, which I'm guessing they just decided to all throw into the same graph here. We have our expectations of future prices. So if we think that the future price is going to be higher, then people will understandably try to consume more of it now. If we have more buyers for the market, that would mean we have more market demand. And then we could have a tax or a subsidy. Where a tax, we increase the price, or with a subsidy, we encourage people to buy it by giving them some money, or by making it less expensive. So an example with that would be, I'm in the process of looking at new cars, and the incentive to buying an electric car is that there's a $7,500 subsidy, right, which basically makes it cost $7,500 less than it otherwise would. Okay, so here we've got the difference of Burger King and Big Macs. So if the price of a Burger King Whopper falls, then people are going to buy less at McDonald's, which is what's shown in the graph here. You get a raise at your job. So in this case, steak dinners must be a normal good, because if you have more income, then you buy more of a normal good. That would be what's appearing right here. And then generic cheese is presumably an inferior good. And so if I get a raise at my job, I'll be like, dude, I'm going to dump the generic cheese. I don't need that junk anymore. And so I'll buy less of it. So same event happening, pay raise at work. But then I do make two changes. I buy less generic cheese, and it looks like I'm buying more steak dinners. And if the price of my favorite beverage falls, then then I would buy more of that favorite beverage. And as I buy more of that favorite beverage, I'm going to buy that really salty pizza that I consume with that beverage, right? And so I buy, these would be complementary goods that exist. And doctors come out with a discovery that oranges cure baldness. Well, I'm guessing here then that people don't want to be bald, and so then they'll say, oh, I'm going to buy lots of oranges to get rid of my baldness, right? And so here we see that the demand for oranges is changing because of this discovery coming out. So this would be a change in preferences. And then if we look at the same market here, the market for Pepsi, and we look at that movement versus that shift. Here, if I say that what happens to my demand for Pepsi as my income increases, presuming that it's a normal good, my demand for Pepsi would increase. Again, that would be shown as a increase in my demand curve. And that, taking this further here, if the price of Pepsi decreases, then what we're going to see here is a movement along the curve. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this here. And in that movement along the curve, that as the price decreases for Pepsi, I'm going to move along the curve. Whereas, just to go back here we've got our increase in demand. So this would be increase in demand. And here I would have increase in quantity demanded. And if we're then again talking about Coke and Pepsi as being substitute goods to one another, then what we're going to see here is that as the price of Coke goes down, then people buy less Pepsi because they're going to shift towards it. So these would be substitute goods. And so this would be people buying. So in the Coke market, we would have a movement along the curve, but in the Pepsi market, we would have a shift of the curve. The movement causes the shift. If that's unclear to you, what I just said, go back to this market right here. Right, and this would be our market for when we have substitutes. Okay. And then here, suppose the price of good X increases in terms of demand. What is the result? Again, this would be our movement along the curve. Changing just the price of the good itself. This is our law of demand at work. Which would just say that as the price goes up, this leads to the quantity demanded falling, moving in the opposite direction of each other. Here, this is not the law of demand. We're saying that goods X and Y are substitute for each other's, and if the price of the other good increases, then people are going to substitute towards this now cheaper good, that the demand for X is going to increase. So, again, what would that look like in this market X? That would mean that my demand curve is shifting to the right. Okay, I'm going to skip this think, pair, share, just because we are not in a class where we need to do that. And that leads us to supply. I'm just going to pause here for a second. Okay, so now with demand out of the way, now we look at supply. And you'll notice that the structure of our discussion about supply is rather similar to demand. So we don't have as many slides about it because the presumption is that you kind of follow the structure of what we're talking about here. So first, right, if we talk about our structure here with P and Q, again with price and quantity, and again we talk about a market, a stapler, then what we're talking about here is that the supply curve is upward sloping. And what each of these points along this curve refer to are quantity supply points, which would tell us that at a particular price, this is what the quantity would be. So it would be the amount of the good or service, meaning the quantity, that producers are willing and able to sell at that price. Right, so each of these points are quantity supply points. The entire curve is the supply curve, which gets us our law of supply, which again, just like it did for demand, this is going to explain movements. It's going to explain movements along the supply curve. And what it's going to do for us is essentially just say that as the price goes up, that leads to the quantity supplied, meaning Q subscript S, to go up as well. And that as the price falls, this leads to quantity supplied falling. And what we can really simply say here is that just think of what a profit maximizing greedy firm would do, right? Is that if they can get more money for it, they're going to sell, they're willing and able to sell more of it. So if the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. If the price falls, they don't want to sell as much of that thing, and so the quantity supplied falls. And again, just as we did before, we can understand the supply two ways, one mathematically or numerically, and the other with a curve. And we would see that here, right? That the higher the price, that the higher the price, then we have connected it at a higher quantity supplied. And that as the price goes down, we have a lower quantity supplied. And we can add up all of the individual supply curves to get a market supply curve. And we can see that here, right? This would be pure food fish and I'm guessing city fish. And if we add those two up together, that what we then see is that at the price of $20, pure food is going to supply 800, city fish is willing to supply 200, 800 plus 200 gets us 1,000, and so on and so forth. Now, this would be the other key slide to understanding here. Just as we did this for demand, we need to do it for supply. In that, what we need to do is we need to differentiate between a movement along the curve versus a shifting of the curve. And this all comes from our definition of what supply is. And that specifically, that a change in quantity supplied looks like, for instance, a movement from A to B. Or it could be from B to A, which is explained by the law of supply, and it occurs because of a change in the price. Shifting the curve would either look like this, which would be an increase, or this, which would be a decrease. Again, the prime standing for the second one. So this would be a decrease. This is caused by changing something other than the price. So it's not caused by changing the price. You cannot use the law of supply to explain this. Law of supply is only occurring when you're changing the price and looking at movements. This is a shift. So as it says here in the second bullet point, caused by a change in a non-price factor. So then the question would be is, what are those non-price factors? Well, to understand that, we'd actually have to go all the way back up to the very beginning here. And that's where we would have these 5 variables: inputs, technology and production processes, sellers, price expectations, and taxes and subsidies. So essentially variables 1 through 5. So what that means that we need to explain here and add back over here, or I shouldn't say add, I just should highlight it further. All else equal, meaning ceteris paribus, which basically would mean that variables 1 through 5 are constant and only the price is changing. And so there's our changes in supply. Shifting to the right would be an increase. Shifting to the left would be a decrease. So what we need to do is look at the 5 factors. The first one being the cost of inputs. So if the inputs go up in price, a big input would be wages, for instance, how much it costs for your workers, but we could talk about other inputs as well. Then in that kind of situation, the supply curve is going to shift to the left. If the inputs are falling in price, then it will increase. or shift to the right. Again, a common one is wages, but we could think of this as anything, raw materials, whatever it takes to build the thing that you're building. Changes in technology or the production processes. Most of the time, technology does get better. And so if we imagine that technology is improving, then basically that makes the operations more efficient, and that would increase supply. Occasionally, technology doesn't improve. Most of the time, that's because we put restrictions on it being used. For instance, like in my job, right, of teaching, professors are getting upset about any even mention of me being replaced, not just me, but any professor being replaced by AI. I'm not sure the fears are founded. I'd like to think I'm a little bit better than AI. But in some universities, they've already outlawed the use of AI to, provide study help or to teach or something like that. So that would be represented by the supply decreasing if we restrict technology from being used. Then we get to taxes and subsidies. And so if taxes go up, it's generally going to lead to a decrease in supply. If taxes go down, then that would be an increase in supply. This kind of graph right here, this very simple graph, this is what tends to be used by, don't worry, I'm going to give equal credit to both parties here. This would be what's used by Republicans for why do they promote or encourage lower taxes, because their belief is that it helps the economy grow. And this is why, generally speaking, businesses are in favor of Republicans with this notion that if the companies are paying less in taxes, it allows them to sell more stuff. Now, here's my equal justice here to something else here. We could have a subsidy, which would mean that the government is paying the seller to produce a certain good. So if the subsidy goes up, then that will encourage supply. So this would be what Democrats are using, for instance, right now with encouraging electric vehicle production. Right, their notion is that electric vehicles are better for the environment. People aren't just going to buy them, though, at the prices that they're at. So the government needs to basically incentivize, encourage producers to make them and for the prices to be cheaper. And so that's what that subsidy would look like. Number of firms. This one's pretty simple. I'm not even going to draw this one out. Basically, if you've got more sellers, then you've got more supply. And then the final one would be price expectations. If you expect the price to be higher tomorrow, then you'll have a decrease in supply because you'll want to just sell the thing instead tomorrow. As long as you can reasonably store the goods. Sometimes that's not really possible. For instance, what if I'm selling like beef or milk? I can't really do that. But if I'm selling like oil, right, which is just kind of stored in the ground until I drill it out, the current supply curve would shift to the left because the price is going to be higher in the future, which is then when I'm going to sell it. Okay, so if the price of cheese decreases, that's obviously an input in the pizza market, then what we would see is that in the pizza market, that the supply would increase. Because essentially it'll be cheaper to now produce pizzas. Which would cause the supply curve of oranges to shift to the left. So a subsidy, that would cause an increase, so that's not our answer. A study is released showing oranges improve eyesight. This actually would affect the demand, not supply. So this one is not correct, right? Because this would encourage people to buy oranges. As long as they could read the study, because apparently they have such bad eyesight. A new orange juice commercial airs on TV. My only guess would be that's demand, maybe because you've got more marketing and people are becoming aware that oranges can be made into juice. But here, an ice storm strikes Florida. This would probably kill orange trees, and make there be fewer oranges existing, which would shift the supply curve to the left, which would cause a decrease in supply of most fruits and vegetables. So if we increase the demand for meat, this would probably, my guess would be, is that it's not going to really affect supply of fruits and vegetables. It might affect the demand for fruits and vegetables. It's unclear, though, because we don't really know if fruits and vegetables are a complement or a substitute to meat. I think you can make a pretty good argument for both, right? At least when I eat meat, I like to eat it with my vegetables. But we could imagine some little kid saying, I don't want to eat my vegetables, just give me a big old pile of meat. So really for I wouldn't ask a question like this because it's pretty vague, but we mostly know that this can't possibly be an answer because it really is probably going to refer to demand for fruits and vegetables and not supply. An introduction of an environmentally friendly pesticide, this would probably increase the supply because basically you would have an ability to have fruits and vegetables not die from bugs because you could spray it with this environmentally friendly pesticide. A decrease in the price of corn and rice. I don't know, maybe no effect would be what I would kind of say. And then finally, harsh punishments for farmers who hire undocumented workers. Well, what would that do? That would increase costs. And why would it increase costs? Because you're going to have higher wages. And what do higher wages look like? Well, what that looks like is the supply shifting to the left, which would be our decrease. Now, the final step to this is that we need to bring this all together into a cohesive market. A market that's going to yield for us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Basically, where will the market settle? That equilibrium price will be where quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demand. And at the equilibrium price, we will get the equilibrium quantity. And when you see the word equilibrium, what you should basically think of is that there's no tendency for change. And what it can create for us are either shortages or surpluses. So here's our shortage. The shortage occurs when quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. And it's caused, essentially, by a price that's too low. Where the price basically needs to rise. Alternatively, with the surplus, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And this is caused by a price that's too high. And price would need to fall. And so this picture is then really important. and what it does. Now, I'm not one to dictate to you how you should live your life, but if you're thinking of getting a tattoo for this class, to memorialize this class, to have fond memories of this class, this is what I would suggest you make a tattoo out of. This picture. This is about as beautiful as it gets here in Chapter 3 for summarizing all that we've learned for the past, 80 minutes or so, through 60-some slides. Why is this picture beautiful? Because what it does is it stops all this. Now, as an economist, I'm saying this, not as just a general person, but it stops all this wasteful talk of prices being too high or too low. They're not. Over the long run, the price will go to the equilibrium as long as we don't interfere in the market. So let's draw it out this way. Right, we've got this beautiful picture right here. But let's just say that we're here in the market for oranges, that it's $4 for a bag of oranges, and that for some reason I'm at 7. Well, the problem is that we have a surplus. And what happens? How would that look? That basically look like, a display in the grocery store that's just really, really full of oranges, which are rotting every day they sit in the grocery store. And so what's the grocery store owner going to do? You're like, geez, can't have all these oranges just sitting here and rotting. What are they going to tell the clerk to do? They're going to say, dude, make a sale on oranges. Get rid of all this extra stuff we've got. What does the sale represent? It represents the price falling. Now, they might not know that the equilibrium price is $4. They'll just say, lower the price. And this is the part I want you to really listen to right here. As they lower the price, two things happen. Quantity demanded goes up. Why? Because of the law of demand. And quantity supplied falls because of the law of supply. And the way that we see this happening here is that we're going to move along the curves until we get to that point. Alternatively, what if I make the price $1? Now I'm going to have a shortage. And how does one react to a shortage? How does a producer react to a shortage? Bare shelves? Well, they're going to raise the price. And what happens? Two things. The quantity demanded is going to fall, and the quantity supply is going to go up. First, because of the law of demand. And quantity supply is going to go up because of the law of supply. And as the price goes up, I'm going to be very careful in the words I'm choosing here. The market finds the appropriate price. The market finds the appropriate price. Now this, my trust of the market, I don't trust a lot of things. I'm a pretty jaded person in general. But I actually do take quite a bit of faith in the market being able to find the appropriate price. I don't know. People are always complaining about prices. People are saying eggs, right now people are saying eggs are way too expensive. Like, I don't know what you want to do. I mean, I don't eat a lot of eggs, but I have kids that eat a lot of eggs that probably buy, I don't know, 2 dozen eggs a week. Right? You got a big family. Am I going to complain about $8 a dozen eggs? I mean, I don't like paying that price, but at the same time, the price is what it is. Now, if they raise the price to, let's say, $12, I'll be like, dude, stop eating so many eggs. I don't know, maybe I'll get chickens or something. I don't know. On the other hand, right, if the price drops down to $4, I don't know, maybe I'll buy a few more eggs, but I'm not just going to eat an only egg diet. But that's the beauty of a price. That's kind of why I like it, at least, because it's not, somebody isn't dictating to me, some official or some other entity isn't dictating to me what I have to buy. I'm just reacting to the price. And so, you know, the market is really good at eliminating shortages and surpluses. So much so that most of us, at least in the United States, don't commonly encounter surpluses and shortages. Because the price being allowed to change basically fixes that and stops that from occurring on a consistent basis. If we think back to COVID, I know it sounds really humane that we did this, but there were all these restrictions on like price gouging, being able to raise the price on like masks and hand sanitizer during COVID. I don't know, maybe someone slept really good at night thinking that they were helping society by making that a law. But what did it do? It made it really difficult for those who are medically vulnerable to be able to, get the things that they needed, right? To get the hand sanitizer they needed, or to get the masks that they needed. Because, right, the store shelves were empty because people were buying things at that really low price. If the price would have been allowed to go up, then the only people buying it would have been the ones that really cherish it, the ones that really need it. Okay. Then we've got some, I want to do these two slides here, and then we'll, I want to talk about the appendix very briefly. Okay, so now we get to the power of economics in being able to talk about this idea of what happens first when one curve shifts. So that's going to be these two slides, and then we're going to turn to the appendix where we look at two curve shifting. Essentially, when just the demand curve increases, when you have some event happening where demand increases, then what we can see here is that the equilibrium price would go from here, or equilibrium would go from here to here. So what we're seeing is that the equilibrium price is going up, and that the equilibrium quantity is going up. Here, when when supply is increasing, now what we see is that the equilibrium price is falling and the equilibrium quantity is rising. That when demand is decreasing, the equilibrium price falls and the equilibrium quantity falls. And that when supply decreases, the equilibrium price goes up and the equilibrium quantity goes down. And so, as economists, we're often deployed to some event happens, right? Like when the war in Ukraine started, it turned out that Ukraine is a large supplier of helium, that Ukraine is a large supplier of sunflower seed oil, which I guess is used for lots of different things. And basically what you could say pretty simply is just an example here. What does war do? It causes helium supplies to, go into the air. People don't grow sunflowers. So supply is going to be decreasing, which meant that we could say prices are going to go up for people buying helium balloons. prices will go up for people buying sunflower seed oil. Or now with bird flu and chickens dying, we know that the supply of eggs is falling, so we can make this very simple prediction that prices are going to go up for eggs. Okay, I'm going to pause the video here, and then I'm going to bring up the appendix just to finish this up. Okay, and then the final part to this here is just to say what happens when two curves change. I'm not sure why the authors of the textbook made this the appendix. They should have just thrown it all in the chapter, if you're asking me. But the idea here is that we could change both the supply curve and the demand curve simultaneously. What happens, though, when you change both curves simultaneously, shift both curves simultaneously, what happens is that you're not going to be able to definitively predict one of the equilibriums changing, but you will know the other. You'll see why. So here, if we look at this market for salmon, let's suppose that two things happen at the exact same time. First, we have a drought. And so what would a drought do? A drought would mean that salmon are going to have a harder time living. So that's going to decrease my supply. And medical journal reports that people who consume salmon live longer. So presumably, people would want to eat more salmon. Now, I want you to pay attention to what I just did here. What I did is I changed them by about the same amount, which caused, more or less, the quantity to not change at all, but the price went up. Now, let's try the same graph with the same events happening. But let's add a little something to this. Let's say that we still have the major drought. So, pretty big shift in supply. And that study does come out, but the prediction now is that people only live 1 day longer. Just 1 day. So the increase in demand won't be that much because people may not even really care. Look at what I did now. So here's my new equilibrium. Here's my old. And look what happens now. I got my quantity to decrease, but my price still increases. And then I could draw it a third way. Let's just say that, yes, it is a major drought, but it doesn't affect rivers that salmon go on. So a very small decrease in supply, but a much larger shift in demand. So see how in these three graphs, in the graph on the very far left, I changed both curves by magnitude by about the same amount. In the graph on the top, I shifted the supply curve by a greater magnitude than demand. And then finally, in the graph down here, I shifted demand more than supply. Now what we're seeing is that my equilibrium quantity went up, and my price still went up. So price went up in any scenario. Quantity, we don't know. We would need to know how much they shift. And that's the key. When two curves are shifting, you need to know how much they're shifting relative to each other to be able to make predictions about both the price and the quantity. Let's look at another example here. right? Well, this is just explaining more about that. Sorry, and it's just explaining more about all these. But as this appendix sort of concludes here, what we can see is that there's one variable that's going to move with certainty, and there's one variable that is going to be a bit more unknown unless we know the relative shift. And so what this next two slides summarizes well for us is that in scenarios where both increase and both decrease, we know the price only if we know the relative changes. So there's uncertainty. The quantity in every situation, right, is going to move with certainty. That specifically quantity will always go up, and here quantity will always go down. But we don't know what will happen to price unless I tell you how much the relative shifts are, meaning that supply shift more than demand, equal to demand, or less than demand. And that will determine whether the equilibrium price rises, falls, or stays the same. And then, if one is increasing and one is decreasing, then what happens is that we know what happens to the price with certainty, but the quantity we don't know. So in this situation, the price would go up, and the price would go down. But the quantity we don't know. And again, it will depend on whether demand or supply shifts more or less than the other. Okay. That finishes us up. This is a very big chapter.